Okay, folks, so we're picking up where we left off with Kant's ethics. So last time we looked at the difference between a hypothetical and a categorical imperative, as well as Kant's principle of humanity. This time around, we're going to look at Kant's principle of humanity rather than the principle of universalizability. So, here's how we might think about it. The categorical imperative is one thing for Kant. The categorical imperative is the moral law. So the thing with the moral law is that for Kant, it is what makes a good will good. As long as you are following the moral law, you have a good will. You want to respect the moral law, and it always applies to you whether you care about it or not. Remember, it's that question of whether this rational imperative on action depends on your desires or not. That's what makes the difference between a categorical and a hypothetical imperative. The categorical imperative does not depend in any way on what you care about or what you desire. So the first way of articulating the categorical imperative is to think in terms of the principle of universalizability, and then we get a second way of thinking about the same thing through the principle of humanity. So there's like one fundamental fact, the categorical imperative, two different ways of thinking about it or articulating it. So what's going on with Kant's principle of humanity? Well, it states, just get the video box out of the way there, it states, always treat a human being, yourself included, as an end and never as a mere means. So the idea is that we want to treat people as ends in themselves and never as mere means. So what is Kant trying to tell us here? Well, he says that to treat somebody as a means is just to deal with somebody so as to achieve your goals, right? Whereas treating somebody as an end is to treat someone with the respect that they deserve. So what Kant is saying is that you always have to make sure that you're treating people with the respect that they deserve as human beings, right? So that's what he's saying when he says that you need to treat people as ends in themselves, right? Now, one common misinterpretation of Kant is to say that you can never treat people in ways where you try to, get them to help you achieve your goals. So you couldn't say, like, depend on your mailman to bring you an important letter that you need, right? Or you couldn't ask your friends or your spouse or your parents for a favor. But what we need to notice here is that Kant doesn't say you should never treat people as means. He says never treat them as mere means. So to treat somebody as a mere means is to deal with someone to achieve your goals, but without respecting that person's humanity. So the idea that Kant has is that people aren't just objects, right? When it comes to something like a water bottle, you can treat that thing as a mere object because it doesn't have humanity to it. What do we mean by humanity for Kant? Well, he tells us that it's not, or we should understand Kant as saying that it's not just a matter of being a member of the species Homo sapiens. It's more about being rational and autonomous. So rationality and autonomy is what makes you the kind of being that is worthy of respect and the kind of being that can't just be treated as an object to be manipulated. So just to be a little more specific for Kant, to be rational is to be a being that uses reason to figure out how to achieve their goals, right? So you might want to achieve several different goals, or you might have a specific goal, and you're going to use reason to figure out what sorts of means you're also going to have to will in order to achieve that. So that's what it is to be rational for Kant. To think through things about how to act and how to live your life. And beyond being rational, you can also be autonomous, right? When you're autonomous, you are going to decide for yourself which principles you're going to use to govern your life, right? So for Kant, the big idea is that we all have laws or principles that make our behavior genuine action, right? Remember how maxims are these plans of actions that we use to govern our lives? Well, the fact that we can guide our actions through the adoption of maxims makes us very special kinds of beings. Because, certainly, like a weather pattern is not autonomous, right? It's just subject to the laws of nature. Whereas for human beings, we are also subject to the laws of morality, and it's our autonomy that lets us decide whether or not to follow those principles. Just to spell this out a little bit more, so now we know that people are rational and autonomous. That's what gives them humanity, and that's going to be what we're supposed to respect according to Kant's principle of humanity. He says, always treat a human being, yourself included, as an end and never as a mere means. Here's a nice way of putting it. This wasn't in your assigned reading, but it is in your Living Ethics textbook. Honora O'Neill says that to really understand the principle of humanity, she's saying that when you treat somebody as a mere means, you're involving them in a scheme of action to which they could not, in principle, consent. So we might think about, for instance, lying to somebody, right? A person couldn't, in principle, consent to being lied to because as soon as you make them aware that they're being lied to, you can't do it anymore. In a similar way, making a lying promise, right? So to make a lying promise is to promise somebody that you're going to do something for them, usually in return for a favor, and then just not do it. So it seems manipulative and morally wrong, and as O'Neill is spelling it out here, she's saying that this Kantian idea is all about, finding ways of treating people that they can consent to, right? So we can think of more cases, right? You cannot, in principle, consent to being lied to or having lying promises made to you. You also can't consent to something like sexual assault. And in some cases, we might even think that certain kinds of violence would be the sorts of actions that a person could not, in principle, consent to. And, we might try to think this through in daily life as well, right? How do we find ways of relating to others as persons and not just things? Well, it might be just a matter of, when you go to the grocery store, you might take that extra second to look your cashier in the eye and thank them for their help. Well, when you do that kind of thing, not only is it gracious and decent, but so it's not just good manners, but it's also acknowledging that there's a person on the other end of that transaction. So even though you're using them as a means, you're getting help from them, you're not treating them as a mere means. You're still acknowledging that there's a person there. So here are some of the benefits of the principle of humanity that Schaefer-Landau notes in the textbook. So he points out that it explains why it's immoral to be a fanatic. So we talked about the fanatic in part 1 of the video. The person who says that people who commit certain sins in their eyes deserve to die. Uh, it also explains why certain actions are immoral. So the principle of humanity says never treat somebody as mere means, and it can then explain why slavery and rape are always wrong, right? Those are the sorts of actions that a person could never consent to, and that's exactly why Kant's theory is so good at articulating these moral thoughts. It explains outrage at paternalism. Schaefer-Landau points out that it in some sense justifies never abandoning hope in people. So because we recognize that all people are free and autonomous, they're rational and autonomous, as it were, you can always hope that maybe, even if they've done wrong before, that they might do better in the future. It also grounds things like universal human rights, right? That everybody has a certain kind of dignity at the core of themselves as humans, and that's why they deserve respect. Explains our practices of holding one another accountable. Again, it's this acknowledgement of others as rational and autonomous beings, and that's why we reason with people. So this is maybe one of the biggest, most powerful ideas from Kant. Treat others as ends in themselves, give them the respect they deserve, and never treat a person as a mere means, that is, as like a kind of object that you can manipulate. So we might also raise some potential problems for the principle of humanity. For one thing, the idea of treating somebody as an end in themselves is kind of a vague idea. It's pretty difficult to apply. What do I have to do in order to treat somebody as an end? So it doesn't really give us an easy test for figuring out which actions are right and which actions are wrong. So for all of its flaws that we saw last time around, it seems like utilitarianism gives us a pretty easy formula for figuring out which actions are right and which actions are wrong. It's just about net balance of happiness over suffering. To the extent that moral questions are hard for utilitarians, it's just that it's hard to know which action is going to bring about the most suffering or benefit. We might also think that maybe there are certain times when it's okay to be paternalistic, right? It might be okay to, think about people not as autonomous beings, but as beings that are influenced by certain non-rational factors. So, this happens a lot of the time in recent economics. So they found that you can get people to make healthier choices at a cafeteria if you put the salad towards the front and the burgers toward the back, right? But that's not really treating people as rational beings. But we might think that, well, it's actually okay to help people make better choices, even if we're not necessarily treating them as rational. We might also wonder about whether this formulation that depends on humanity leaves certain individuals out. So for one thing, it might do a bad job of explaining why we should treat animals well. They're not necessarily rational or autonomous in the way that human beings are, but we still shouldn't hurt them. Maybe Kant is going to have a harder time explaining that. We might also notice that certain human beings aren't rational and autonomous. So people with severe mental disabilities, with brain injuries, or with certain decision-making deficits. Do these people deserve less moral respect as ends in themselves, according to Kant's principles? So these are hard questions. And we might think about the extent to which Kant's principle of humanity can be made to work, and maybe whether there might be some arguments for the principle of humanity that might be separable from Kant's own justification, which was based on rationality and autonomy. So just to recap, we looked at the difference between categorical and hypothetical imperatives, right? That was all about whether these commands of reason depend on your desires or not. We had the principle of universalizability, which said that your acts should be guided by a maxim that you could will to be universal law. So everybody's maxim. If your maxims aren't universalizable, then you're making yourself an exception to morality, Kant thinks. And then we also looked at the principle of humanity. Treat others as ends in themselves and never as mere means. So those are the big, important ideas for Kant. Thanks for listening in. And if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to get in touch. All right, thanks. Take care, and bye.